So hello, everyone. Thank you again so much for joining us this evening. My name is Melissa Giblin. I am the Programs Coordinator at North Carolina Humanities, and it is my pleasure to be speaking to you all today from Charlotte, North Carolina. At North Carolina Humanities, we aim to bring North Carolinians together to have shared experiences around the humanities and dialogue amongst themselves to create understanding and deeper human connections that can strengthen our statewide community. North Carolina Humanities is pleased to present Guide the Way, Traveling the Historic South and the Poetry of Today. Today, we will hear a short history of the Green Book and its role in not only keeping travelers safe, but also of building community in the South. We will also hear excerpts from a poetic Green Book that convey experiences of family, traveling away from and returning to home, and belonging. And lastly, our featured panelists will come together in conversation about the connections of themes between this history and poetry. As a last reminder, you can learn more about North Carolina Humanities and our programs by visiting our website at www.nchumanities.org. North Carolina Center for the Book is an affiliate of the National Center for the Book in the Library of Congress and is made possible with support from the State Library of North Carolina. It is a program of NC Humanities. North Carolina Humanities is a statewide nonprofit and affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Please note that any views, findings, conclusions, opinions, or recommendations expressed by our partners and participants do not necessarily represent those of NC Humanities or the National Endowment for the Humanities. So for some housekeeping, today's webinar is being recorded. There is a closed caption feature that is available for today's event. Please click the CC button at the bottom of the screen. We'd love to hear from you during today's event. If you have a question, please send it through the Q&A tab or through the chat. It's my pleasure to welcome our panelists, Tyree Day and Dr. Torrin Gatson, and moderator Cecilia Thompson. Before I turn the evening over to Cecilia, we have a special guest who will be making a few short remarks. Please welcome preservationist and CEO of the Historic Magnolia House and Foundation, Natalie Pass-Miller.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm Natalie Pass-Miller. I am the CEO of the Historic Magnolia House. We are located in Greensboro, North Carolina. We are the historic hotel where African Americans stayed during the Jim Crow era. And also we're listed in 6 editions of the Green Book. And when you look at us in the Green Book, you will also note that we are starred in each of those editions, which meant we were the hotel of prominence, the only hotel of prominence between Atlanta, Georgia, and Richmond, Virginia. So feel free to please come visit us today at our Living Museum, in which we are able to do private events. We have museum and education programming, as well as arts programming. And then we also are excited, we'll be opening up the hotel this fall, at which point will be a 100% replica of the 1949 Green Book Hotel. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Natalie, for sharing the wonderful work that you all are doing at the Historic Magnolia House. It is my pleasure to now turn the evening over to our moderator, Cecilia Thompson.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you, Natalie, for being here. I am thrilled to be a part of this panel today, especially as I'm sitting here in Greensboro, North Carolina, and an honored member of the North Carolina Humanities Board of Trustees. Natalie is not only a neighbor, but a favorite person and friend of mine who's a big contributor here in Greensboro. And I will say that if you want your own copy of the Green Book, this is the 1959 edition. You can get one at the Magnolia House. So please come and visit. I already had her page starred where the Magnolia House was starred. So really thrilled to be a part of today's discussion. So we are going to start off the evening with Dr. Torrin Gatson, who is a public historian and assistant professor of history at North Carolina UNC Greensboro, just right up the street. And he's going to share a little bit of the context of the Green Book in American history. So Dr. Gatson, I'm going to pass it on to you.
In 1932, retired World War I veteran and postal carrier Victor Hugo Green conceived of an idea to interlock African-American travelers disjointed through measures of violence, intimidation, and segregation. His creation, the Negro Motorist Green Book, presented African Americans detailed lists of accommodations for travel, shopping, and for a host of other services. First published in 1936 and running continuously until 1966, the Green Book served as a vessel which guided African Americans to places of leisure while simultaneously serving as a tool to fight and dismantle systemic racial discrimination. Next slide, please. So to talk a little bit about how it began, Victor Green compiled a simple list of stores, services, and lodging options in New York City in specific for African Americans traveling in. In this effort, Green was attempting to carve out a snapshot space on the landscape for African Americans who were venturing to New York and wanted to do so safely. But understanding the growing popularity, Green quickly moved beyond New York and began documenting other cities and states around the country, and eventually even published international editions. Next slide, please. To talk a little bit about how it spread, the Green Book spread like wildfire for a few reasons. After the war, and that would be World War I, Green was employed as a postal worker, as I mentioned earlier. And this gave him ample access to thousands of Americans through his friends and supporters in the post office. And along the years, other organizations supported the Green Book. Next slide, please. And perhaps one of the most telling was that of Standard Oil, formerly Esso gas station. And Esso was known for hiring and marketing towards African Americans long before their competitors. And that connection, along with other sponsors, helped drive production and also sale of the Green Book. Next slide, please. Here in North Carolina, there were approximately 327 businesses listed in the Negro Motorist Green Book. In Greensboro, for which I teach, as was mentioned, and have conducted research more recently, there were approximately 17 sites. And one of the most notable is the historic Magnolia House. Next slide, please. The ultimate decline of the Green Book took place roughly after the Civil Rights Bill of 1964, and a national shift to integration of services and travel, in part, spelled the end of the Green Book as a major source for travel and planning for African Americans. But however, to understand the major themes of the Green Book is perhaps even more important as we, reminisce about its importance on the landscape. And those major themes to discuss just for a moment are that of leisure, resistance, entrepreneurial spirit, the roles of women, and that of material culture. And so to speak about leisure for a moment, when we think about the Green Book, we often think of it as a tool, right, that helped people maneuver safely. But what sometimes we miss is how this tool was also used for ideas of respite or for leisure. For African Americans, the journey or the odyssey here in America has been one filled with struggle, but triumph has been found in glimpses. And so this Green Book in many ways gave access to that of rest, right? To leisure, to seeing family, to seeing friends. When we talk about resistance, the Green Book is just that. It's a tool for African Americans to find uplift through travel, right? To explore new places, right? And to overcome and unlock new vortexes of understanding. But in the major theme of entrepreneurial spirit, economic independence reigned supreme. For African Americans, were able to indulge in businesses owned and operated by African Americans, right? Their own people. Now, one will be remiss without mentioning the large impact of the role of women within the Green Book itself and all of the organizations throughout the South. There were a number of notable women who owned and operated hotels, for instance, as well as many other orifices, whether it be salons, drugstores, or beauty shops. And lastly, to talk about one of the major themes just in brief, which I'm sure we'll unpack in just a little bit, is that of material culture, right? The physical essence of the book, the highways, the material culture of the landscape itself, and the transformation of travel for African Americans with the formal introduction into, the mass introduction, into automobiles and moving across the country. And so when we think about the Green Book, we should think about all of these things along with safe travel along the highways for African Americans, because all of this together kind of tells or begins to tell rather that story of the Green Book.
Thank you, Dr. Gatson. That was really interesting and made me think about sort of the history of Greensboro here as the Gate City and how that aligned with the transportation system of people coming through Greensboro and stopping at the Magnolia House. And so the tying of those histories, I'm sure you could go on for days. And so thanks for giving that overview. I now want to welcome Tyree Day. Tyree is a poet and the author of Cardinal. He is also a UNC Chapel Hill teaching assistant professor, and I've had the privilege of owning his book and reading it to prepare for today. And so I'm excited to hear from Tyree 3 poems that he's selected from the book Cardinal. So I'm going to pass it to you, Tyree.
Thank you. Dr. Gasson did such a great job that I lied about the poems. I'm going to read more than 3, but it's only 2 more. Just because like there's
I fully support that.
Okay. There's so many things I heard that I was like, oh yeah, that's definitely a theme in this book, and I want to make sure. Thank you
Run
for
with it.
such a great presentation. Number 1. All right, here we go. So I'm thinking about Cardinal. When I was writing the book, I was thinking about my own personal migration, my family's migration, and this larger narrative of a people's migration. And I wanted to, and thinking about that in terms of, I like the idea of when poetry happens that you can mash time all together. In my mind, poetry is like the closest we can get to time travel. And so in this book, we're constantly jumping in time, right? So we're not only learning about my personal migration, my family's, but we're also right moving in time and trying to really connect all these moments. Okay, I think that's enough. All right. By land. I've lived on dirt roads that bent and ended at a gate of ponds. The dust skipped up, didn't make my mother look like a dream I've lived on roads that drag through America. I've paced only them to the next town. The road we kissed on is gone, rich folks buying up all the city in which we make do. I miss when Sonny could do a wheelie all the way down Person Street, and no one would call the police because he was a part of the neighborhood like the honeysuckle bush between 2 yards. And he was beautiful, not like a horse standing alone in a yellow field, but like a man is beautiful. Most of the little towns have a road nicknamed Devil's Turn, where someone's brother died on a Saturday night while Nina sang Tell Me More and More and then some on the Caddy's radio, the moon the color of the Otis Cardinal. Every road isn't a way out. Some circle back like wolves. You can't get lost on them and they won't lose you. Others wait for you to run out of gas, then come alive with what your mother said would take you. Every road promises something like a father does, but when you arrive, the town is empty and you wait like a child questioning everything, the road itself, laughing like a drunk man falling into a roadside ditch. The road I'm walking now is howling and full of moon. Hopefully it will lead to myself. Hopefully they'll take me home. And now this next poem is kind of thinking about my family's history of migration. Where she planted hydrangeas. My grandmother migrated from South Carolina to North Carolina with 3 children, a sister named Betty Lee, and a best friend named Lou. They sailed here and prayed God lined the highway with angels whose wings could hide them from every evil thing. On moonless roads, the stars gone missing. They arrived like most Black folk looking for more than a field to turn over, to find a dead turkey vulture's feathers scorched under the truthful dirt. Its wings bent as if it died, saluting the dead rabbit it stood over. What stood over them was a field the hands will never stop touching. They slept on homemade beds and ate over fires out of a cast iron pot. A whole community gathered together in the woods to pull wild onions, to pick pecans off the cold ground. All her dreams she scattered like chicken feed across the yard. My mother, aunts, and uncles ate those chickens and they sewed those dreams into us, our purple under the windowsill of those lives. And so to keep going, this is The Mechanical Cotton Picker for Black Chicago Poets. If I'm thinking about where we are in time right now in this book, I'll say we're in 1947 in Mississippi. The Mechanical Cotton Picker for Black Chicago Poets. It wasn't that they killed John Boy in front of his mama's small blue house and that no one called her Miss Bluebird anymore out of respect, though she never minded the name. It made her believe she'd fly off someday, or that the sheriff let John Boy's body sit until even the baby stopped crying, their eyes filled with him, his body already going to marble, no one would be able to lift from their sleep. It was that we could feed ourselves then by getting down on our hands and knees to pick cotton, and most knew what a body smelled like blowing down a dirt road. When Chicago reached my ear, the war was full of bodies. They sent whole train cars for us Black folk. I read The Defender and waited to hide my face behind the curtains of a northbound train, and I prayed the train car would fly. The South truly don't want us to go. A Mississippi cop would catch a family disappearing behind a rainstorm and send them home, the clouds leaving 4 muddy fields at a time. I left like a season's first lover across a window, slowly like a southern sun, diagonal on a work back. I wanted to carry my aunts to Chicago with me, like this obituary-filled Bible, these plums I got saved, purpling in my bag. All right, 2 more, you all. And so if I'm thinking about this like constant, my migration, my family's migration, this larger migration, this book kind of does that over and over, right? That loop. And that's kind of the progression of how we work through the book. So let's see. And so I'll read this poem. Actually, I'll read this one first. How do you get to Harlem? What did I know of skylines, of a skinned sea of brown faces, not in the field, but walking down Lenox Avenue? Our cousins from New York talked about Harlem the way our aunts in their Sunday stockings over the shower curtain drying like tobacco leaves, talked about a heaven I tried to imagine, a skyline where a patch of pine stood and sometimes swayed. Every summer when they visit, we make a moon around them and listen to stories about city life. My mother always in the background, shaking her head. She could hear us leaving already. My favorite part was the train, how it could take you where you needed to be. All right, and last poem I'll read. I was thinking about this idea of like this leisure travel to see family. And I think that's also right, so important when we're discussing that it was for leisure too. And I think maybe this poem tries to get close to that. The world grows. Once the world was no bigger than railroad divided Youngsville. Once we made it to South Carolina, all of us alive for the family reunion. Once 2 miles from the city limits, my uncle was pulled out of the car to have his corn-filled pockets searched. Once to see the ocean, we took the back way out of town. We lived in a circled path and made do behind kerosene's heat. Once my mother, in the shape of God, pointed to the moon in the screen door. Around a card table with her brothers and sisters, and gin they trusted the squash would sprout away. Once I trusted a hand pointing north. Once I called for a wolf and a man walked out of the night. I walked Youngsville and marked myself down on a map I was making. Once for my birthday, my family gathered near the rusted cars in our backyard. In my happiness, the color of balloons. Thank you.
Thank you, Tyree. It was really great, and I'm glad that you shared an extra 2 poems with us. Well, I want to transition now to the conversation, which I know is going to be very, very robust between Dr. Gatson and Tyree. And so I'm going to kick it off with some questions, but if you are listening as an audience member, please submit your questions through the chat and we'll get to those soon. So the first question I have is about the intersection of race and place and how it affected US history and culture. How have they affected North Carolina specifically, that intersection of place and race? And I'm going to open it up to either Dr. Gadsden or Tyree.
Sure. So, race, which is a social construct, played a pivotal role in shaping the American landscape. A short voyage through time easily depicts North Carolina and the South's grappling with race, from the institution of enslavement, the reliance on enslaved labor, in essence, the economic stability of the state and country, to the American narrative with respect to the American Civil War and ideas of freedom, right? Through Reconstruction, as the nation was pieced back together and the assemblages of laws and rights that were presented to supposedly protect peoples of color, through the 20th century, where Jim Crow laws used race as the basis to enforce violence and segregatory practices, through the Black freedom struggle, and the always constant vignettes of Black uplift amidst all of those struggles. So in essence, the history of America and race and space are intrinsically locked. And so in North Carolina, when we, try to take that away, we're not necessarily telling a comprehensive story of how all things together created, that idea or the state's history.
Tyree, did you want to add anything to that?
I'm just thinking about the census report that came out today, and this idea that the amount of people doesn't equal power, right? And North Carolina, right, is such a great state to talk about this idea of gerrymandering, right? And this is essentially what we're the real conversation, at least for right now, for what's happening, right? It's interesting to me to see, right, all these connections, right? That we're really still dealing with this, and just how set people are in remaining, right, for the system to remain. That's it, really.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point about the census. I mean, even here in Greensboro, as we become more and more diverse as a community, it doesn't necessarily, the increase of people of color in the Greensboro area is not reflective in terms of the economic mobility of that same population. And so we're still burdened by racial disparities here, and they are very much connected to geography. And those are things that we work on and struggle with daily as a city. So I think that's a good tie to where we are today, and hopefully what we can do to make it look different for the future. So next, I think this question is great for you, Dr. Gadsden. Can you talk about the connections that you see between the Historic Green Book travel guide and the themes in Tyree's poems?
Sure. So, some of the most immediate themes that derive from Day's work to me are that of leisure and memories, right? So I'm using the term memory to support the notion that historically African Americans had to work due largely to systemic challenges and barriers imposed on them to find positivity in a world of struggle. So from that standpoint, leisure, several of Day's poems kind of bask in a place where travel presents a portal. It's kind of funny that you mentioned, time travel and things like that, but it presents a portal to either escape or to find that which is tranquil, right? So two poems in specific by Tyree, from my point of view, obviously, I Don't Know What Happens to the Fields and From Which I Flew, to me speak to the innocence experiencing the landscape while also vividly feeling all the pain, happiness that accompany those feelings. So when we think about the Green Book, it was a resource that allowed people to experience travel, but that travel was still not always a positive experience. Nonetheless, they were afforded that opportunity to have that voyage. And so sometimes the experience in itself is the beauty, no matter what comes from it.
You should
Go ahead.
My book for me. Something I've just realized is how important work as a theme is in my writing, and it makes sense. It's always work and safety,
Mm.
It seems the two things I'm constantly going back to, and it makes sense, right? I think that's something that maybe that we all want, right? This idea of work and safety, and I feel like I'm constantly, even this idea of in memory, like going back and not trying to rewrite memory, but trying to bring those from the past with me.
Yeah, it's almost like that break, right? So if we take that pause, not to completely kill the word leisure, but it's almost as though a lot of what I read in those, beautifully crafted poems was a respite in between, work and creating memory, right? And so at some point you have to take a step back. So I could vividly depict some of those poems where individuals, families are traveling, but yet take a moment and step back and reflect on what's happening around them or how they're actually able to see Harlem, what Harlem looks like versus being in the field or, riding. I don't want to give too much away. There's other questions, but it really shows that when you are able to really see the landscape for what it is, you have a deeper appreciation, right? And so when we talk about that, for me, it kind of goes back or harkens back to the Green Book, because make no mistake about it, a lot of the history, right, and this type of history in specific for African Americans is through forced trauma, right? The Green Book was not something that ever would have imagined needed to be created. But by happenstance of segregation and Jim Crow and all the other issues that we know about, this comes out to create a way, to create an avenue or a lane by which we can still obtain those same liberties. And so, I think, that's where that lies for me.
I'm thinking about this idea when I'm thinking about craft, I'm always thinking about that, like craft is life and life is craft. And we build our craft out of the life. And so now I'm thinking about the Green Book as also this piece of art at the same time, which is an interesting way to think about the book, that it is unnecessary, but also it's a piece, the way it was built, right? It came out of this need, and that, I don't know, in my mind, it also feels like how art is created.
Yeah, I would definitely agree, because as you see, as time lapses, the Green Book becomes more provocative, right? Not only in its message to the travelers, but also, they would have directed messages to people. They would have statements from other famous individuals. It became almost a piece of literature that you wanted to have, not just so you could secure safe travel, but also to learn from. And so art in many cases is there to inspire, or at least to invoke conversation, to invoke thought. And so when you're doing that, it's art, no matter the packaging.
I think that's a great segue to the next question. When I was thinking about your conversation, I was really thinking about nostalgia and how a lot of that is sort of a through line through many of the poems of Tyree's, and especially the inheritance poem, the opening of "My mother will leave me her deep black cast iron skillet someday." And so I guess this question is for you and Tyree and Dr. Gatson. In what ways are the experiences and family memories in your poems indicative of a larger regional and national experience? Tyree, you can jump in, or Dr. Gatson.
Yeah, so on a craft level, I think I will always explore memory. That's my means of making meaning, right? So I go back to the past and I'm looking for those, I'm going back to that cookout when I was 6, and I'm looking for something in that moment, right? Something that can hopefully tell me about the situation that I'm currently in, right? And so that's I kind of forgot your question, but I love I love talking about memory. And so for me, memory is craft. And so we go back, I set the scene for the reader, but then I attempt to make meaning of it. And this could mean this about this certain situation. That hawk flying by could mean this. And so that's the move in my work that I'm constantly making, right? Trying to make meaning out of these images that keep showing up in my head.
Tyree, do you think that those memories, especially the ones that you have in the poems, are indicative of a national or perhaps a regional experience that others were sharing?
Yes and no. So it's familiar things, but it's poetry. So I like to make the familiar do unexpected things, right? So you've all seen a vulture, but maybe not that vulture standing over a dead rabbit in the field, or you know what I mean? And so they're familiar things, but to make the metaphor happen, I make them do an unexpected thing.
Yeah, and just as a brief follow-up, as I see it, for instance, one for this, question, the world grows kind of stands out in my mind because when you take that journey as a person identifying as an African American specifically, or any person of color, or anyone for that matter, if they find relation, a lot of things resonate very sharply out of this entire poem, right? Talking about once the world no bigger than the railroad divided Youngsville. When you are a youth, everything looks so much larger. Everything looks so much more than sometimes it is, but that is your reality at that moment. And then from there, kind of walking through how you see the world, but also how you experience it. And a lot of times we take things for granted that are relational, but they're international, right? This idea of a family reunion in the South, venturing from where you are to the southern area, right? Returning to your roots or returning to where your people are from, to engage in with family. And even that next part for me, once 2 miles from the city limits, my uncle was pulled out of the car to have his coin-filled pocket searched. I think that was like just a masterful way to talk about the realities, right? And some of those sharp realities. Again, my uncle's pulled over for what reason I don't know, probably for no good reason, and is searched, and his pockets are, and this is basically he's accosted. So we are engaging in that too. But every single instance or brief vignette that Tyree speaks about are somehow reminiscent to me, just through living as an African American and seeing what all peoples around the world go through. And there, I think, those family memories, right? That this is how it's indicative to this larger regional or national experience. If you're able to, you basically just have to find your way or your avenue in which to plug in, and you're able to see how these things connect.
I love that. So I think that's such a great comment for about craft and this idea that we're all really writing about love, death, and desire, right? And so though you might not know my experience, that familiarity of the things I include in the poems helps you connect to them, right? If your mother never stood in the screen door and pointed to the moon, you still know all the words in that sentence and can put that together in your head, right? And what that image may look like. And so, right, that's such a great craft for you to know your, this is not my language, but find a language that feels like a home, right? And then to write from that space, find a language that feels like a home.
Very nice. So Dr. Gatson, you often through your courses and through your research utilize material culture to examine historical events for deeper understanding. And Tyree has done that similarly in poems such as Inheritance and The Motorcycle Queen, when he uses two specific pieces of material culture, the cast iron skillet and the motorcycle, to illustrate how these items are more than simple objects. They are more than just a singular intended use. And so I think this is sort of a nice flow from the last conversation is, what do you both see as the importance of material culture in telling stories and evoking memories?
So, the material past, is the past of experience, right? So while the stories of people's lives are important and written in oral tradition are recorded, the reminiscence of people's belongings, right? Family heirlooms or even physical buildings tell stories. So for instance, in Dave's poem, Inheritance, one can feel the power and the honor in receiving his mother's cast iron skillet, which for many within the African American right, that is a high honor because the food and the history of foodways, everything is etched into that piece. But I also took it, slightly from another angle as well, in that the inheritance, also the burden of all the positive and negative memories associated with it, right? So this object, the skillet, tells the story of Dave's mother, who stood crooked perhaps from cooking or crooked, and in that statement, just who stood crooked, right? And I'm thinking perhaps from cooking as a profession, perhaps to afford the life she provided. And then I jumped to the poem, The Motorcycle Queen, but it again presents a depiction of how material culture and other objects that people use in their evoking of culture are present on the landscape. So in that poem, the motorcycle, as I saw it, is a metaphor for seeing the world and in essence, the materiality of space. And so when we use objects to tell stories, in most cases, we are getting closer to, I don't want to say the truth, but we're getting closer to a more appropriate, view of reality and how people really engaged and enacted. It's one thing to tell somebody from an historical perspective, this is the kitchen where, this woman cooked, and this is the skillet that this woman used. But it's different when you understand the love, the blood, the sweat, all of the memories that went into, producing food. And for all of it to be encapsulated in that object, as that object maneuvers, so do all of those stories, so do all of those meanings. And so, really that material forged with that culture. I mean, I know that's, material culture is the word, but really understanding that these objects themselves tell or further explain, in many cases, people's upbringing or people's holistic narrative, should I say.
Yeah, I'm about to start teaching again on Wednesday, and you just said something really great that I think I'll make sure I tell my students about poems. The poems need love, but they also need blood and sweat. I think that's right, that we need all three maybe to make a good poem, to show the fullness of the reality, right, of being human. Yeah, you gotta, something I was taught early is to fill your poems with tangible things, right? Things that the reader can pick up and put back down. We that physicality of the story we want to experience with you, right? So again, even if you've never seen a cast iron skillet, pick one up, right? This idea of this physicality I put in a poem puts you in that world, right? And that's really what I'm trying to do with the book, but also with each poem, this physical world, this little mini world I can place you in. So I have to give you something. I have to put your feet on the ground, meaning I have to tell you where you are, right? And then I have to put things in your hand, right? And like show you what they feel like and what they can do.
Yeah, and to that, I think one of the things why this book is such a huge success, you spared no expense in having each particular person who is, the discussant in the poem, pay attention to everything. When we think about travel, many times I'm going from destination one to destination. I'm going from point A to point B, and I'm not really basking in everything that I'm experiencing. I'm not really savoring the moment. However, when you think about the motorcycle queen, that entire journey, everything is captured. And while I can actually see it, right? It has this very crystallized view. It's because everything was observed. And I think that's powerful too, to your point when you mentioned earlier about, tangible things. Like, are you saying something that I can see, that I can taste, that I can actually feel? And I think those experiences have those meanings too. When I think about a cast iron skillet, I think about cornbread that has just soaked up every bit of juice and life in it. And while it's not the only thing that's cooked in it, that for me is that, material connection, should I say. So I think a lot of those poems capture so many pieces of a view, right? A dynamic view that you're able to digest that story for positive and for negative. And I think, lastly, to your point, yeah, there's a yin and a yang. Like, that is how things work. And so, in order to talk about the Green Book, one must always come back to the foundational principle for its existence. And that is not in, it's not in that is not in large part for positive reasons, right? People were denied access. People had to make a way. And so while that trickles down to struggle and pain, which I think then are adequate elements to include, that's why it may seem like I keep returning to that, but I think it's important because, this type of travel still was burdensome. It still was laborious, right? No matter how beautiful.
So speaking of that history, I think it's important to go back and see and talk about your roles, both of you as historians and poet. What is your role in preserving the history and the experience of past generations, specifically through this connection to the Historic Green Book?
I always think about poetry as history on the ground, that every day, what it means to be human, like history. I'm not necessarily thinking about, I think that's just something ingrained in me, right? To always be remembering and thinking about these folks from my past. So I think I will always be doing that in my writing. And so I'm not necessarily constantly thinking about, I think I'm always going to write poems, right? I don't really know how to do anything else. So
I think, I think it's, absolutely essential to not only preserving the past, but in many cases, actually interpreting the past. The voices of those who experience many of the situations or events that we've discussed here tonight, it gives validation to the struggle, but also triumph, right, in the midst of those events. So, as a public historian, I understand the tremendous weight, but also the responsibility um, in collecting oral histories, right? Many times capturing those oral narratives prevent those narratives from being lost to time and to history forever. And it is true, while these events occurred, each person's experience varies in the historical account of the event, right? So their different understanding and perspective of that event is what makes history and time nuanced and at the same time provocative. And so in either case, preserving those blended histories just helps us to tell a more comprehensive understanding of the past. We kind of stray away from this word of truth, right? That's clearly an eye of the beholder. But if you're telling something that's more inclusive, right, more comprehensive, oftentimes it makes for a better story.
I agree. I think I feel and have so much more compassion too when reading Tyree's poems and connecting that to place and to history. And so I think even this conversation between both of you, a historian and a poet, about a topic and that through line between of the Green Book and the history, both challenging and heartbreaking, but also what brought us here. And so this week in history when they put it on YouTube. So I do want to open up to questions from the audience. And Melissa, Tyree, jump in.
So Dr. Gatson, I would love to hear, this is not a fully formed question. I would just love to hear your thoughts on what a modern day Green Book would look like, but also how how 2020 and 2021 will change what we know of what the Green Book looks like. Or do you think it will? If COVID, right, how COVID has affected Black folks in particular, how do you think it will change the idea of the Green Book? Or will it? I don't even know what I'm really,
I'm not sure if it'll change the narrative, but I think, in light of everything that's come out, all the good works, the good, interpretation through exhibition and just people writing, including your work, that kind of brings more people to that attention, right? About 5 or so years ago, you could actually ask more people than not what was the Green Book, and then people were unaware of its role. But when you ask someone 60 or older, it brings back very sharp memories, right? I think what a Green Book would look like today would actually be really interesting. I've never thought about that, but immediately my mind starts racing because I think that there are numerous bastions of culture around that are particular to the African American spirit in the ways of just social activity, positive reinforcement, food ways, religious connections, that are still on the landscape, but they're treading water to survive. And so I think a green book today will probably be more of an endangered list, right, of spaces that one should go to get a better framing, right, a better grounding in their own history or familial connection before they're gone. You can imagine how many people are unable to visit certain places, and so they never gain that full understanding of how important it is. And so I always tell the story. I was at a plantation in North Carolina many years ago, and I purposely, stood in a enslaved dwelling outside, and it was about 100 plus degrees of heat, and it was claustrophobic. There were so many different emotions and smells and feelings, but being in that space, right, I felt like, I can never do anything in my lifetime that would amount to even a minute in the life of an enslaved person, but I felt a connection. I felt that there was something there, right? And so visiting those places, and not just even places of the 19th or 18th century, but even modern day, right? Visiting places connected to the Black freedom struggle, right? Some coined it the civil rights movement. I think are important. So I think that if we were to look at it today, it would have that spin, because the reality is, while the long fight is not over, we are able to visit a number of places, unlike during the Green Book, during the time of the Green Book.
I think that's a good question. I mean, I'm not an expert. I just am thinking about sort of what Dr. Gadsden, you talked about this book as a tool, and there are other tools that African American communities are creating to create more economic mobility within communities. And so are those the Equity Fund that supports Black-owned, minority-owned businesses to provide capital, like those sorts of tools. That's not a book. It might not be as poetic, but it can be in sort of the promise of generational wealth and how we build it. So I don't know if that's modern day Green Book or not, but I think about sort of what the modern day tool is to advance African American communities.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely see that. I think, there are a number of tools that are used in order to battle against, just disenfranchisement and unfair targeting of African Americans. And so when I'm talking about it as a tool for, or a tool of resistance, right? It's what are you doing to combat what has been done to you? And so I think that is that bloody, that painful side. But I think in the midst of its creation, in reaction to that, something beautiful came out of it almost. It's kind of thinking about how some of the most beautiful things on earth are formed under tremendous pressure and tremendous toil. But the end product is something more fragile.
Melissa, I know that we have at least one or two questions from our friends in the audience.
Yes, Cecilia, thank you. We do have a question from Lisa. She said she was taken by Tyree's idea of poetry and time travel, and she wanted to know what kinds of historical details do you base poems on when writing about times before you were born?
So I grabbed some books that I wrote Olive Cardinal, mostly outside of North Carolina. I was in Massachusetts in the North for the first time. And so this idea of being outside of home and trying to deal with all those feelings, like to love and hate a place was coming up. But so there's some books that I turned to. So this is the Post-Racial Green Book that came out in 2017. This is Brown Bird Books out of New Orleans. The Warmth of Other Suns, of course. And then another book I turned to, 4 Years of African American Folklore. It's such an important book just for my writing in general. And so the way I don't know. I read so many narratives around the Great Migration that they're kind of just sprinkled throughout the book. So I think about the mechanical cotton picker. That's from just research I did online. I've listened to a narrative, a lady that was from Mississippi that was talking about the mechanical cotton picker, right? And so that's usually how, same way I would do with an image, right? I would hear this little part of a story and kind of build from that. That answers the question.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that was it for questions, though we'll keep it open for a minute or two. So if anyone else has a question they want to pop in Q&A or chat for any of our panelists. Okay, we've got some just wonderful comments here from Janet about being from North Carolina and Virginia, and she shared some things with us. Thank you, Janet, for sharing that. And if we've got any other questions, just be sure to pop those in the chat.
Dr. Gatson, this was so much fun. Thank you. You kind of, I think you're inspiring new poems, new things for me to think about. So it was really nice to get that presentation, and all your answers to the questions. Just really great.
No, thank you. I mean, I was familiar with the book, but sitting with it for much longer, it's definitely a companion, a reader that should accompany kind of understanding that, era in travel and understanding the African-American experience, because there's a lot there. And I think, one of the things overarchingly is that when we, combine more of the arts and history, that's where things truly come out. A lot of times we like to look at records and documents, and those are important, but that object or material, those paintings, right? Those folklore stories, those tales, these poems, oftentimes they are riddled with historical fact and truth. And so it was very refreshing for me to be able to step away from what I was doing and to really just, dive in, to fall into this. And so thank you.
I would love to hear about anything you're researching or thinking about now, just to put you on the spot.
Man, there's a lot. So you mentioned craft, and I'm the co-director of the Black Craftspeople Digital Archive. And so me and my colleague are reclaiming and storing and interpreting all of the lives and interactions and works of Black craftspeople on the landscape. And so when you think of craft, that's everything from, shoemakers to wheelwrights to brick masons to tinsmiths to, hucksters to mechanics to all walks of life. And so that has been, important. And also, I'm a scholar of housing. So thinking about how this relates to just, the equity as far as housing, right? And the African Americans on the Southern landscape in particular. So there was so much I was able to pull out and kind of, spearheading, or actually, dovetails into what I'm currently working on. But as a public historian, sometimes, I'm working on like 25 things at once, as we all mostly are in our careers. So it's
Awesome.
Very cool. Well, I want to just thank Tyree and Dr. Gatson. It's just an honor to be a part of this conversation. And I enjoyed reading your book, Tyree, and of course, enjoyed getting to know you, Dr. Gatson. I will put a plug in again for the Magnolia House. Please come to Greensboro and visit. Just down the street is the Greensboro History Museum, and they have an exhibit right now that's been extended called Pieces of Now, which is really history in the present of 2020, including the pandemic here in Greensboro, but also civil unrest and the protests that happened are really well archived at the museum. And so make a day out of it. Have lunch at the Magnolia House, explore the museums, go see Dr. Gatson at UNCG. So thank you again, and I'm going to pass it back to Melissa.
Thank you, Cecilia, and thank you to our panelists, to Tyree for reading his poems from Cardinal, and to Dr. Gatson for presenting that history and for all of the conversation, and to you, Cecilia, for moderating this evening's event. Thank you to our attendees, and if you are interested in seeing what else North Carolina Humanities is up to and joining us for another program, You can check out our website at www.nchumanities.org, and there's a few links in the chat. And as we mentioned previously, this recording will be available at a future date. So thank you all so much for joining us, and have a wonderful evening.